So here's our fourth part on the cellular respiration lecture. Again, keep in mind the big picture of what we're talking about. There are two types of cellular respiration. You have aerobic, which requires oxygen, and you have anaerobic, which does not require oxygen. The key or the goal of cellular respiration is a conversion of energy from one form into another and the production of ATP. Trying to maximize ATP output is essential for all living organisms so that they can sustain life. So ATP is the essential energy source for life. Now how we get there varies. Our caterpillar in the image here is eating a leaf to get ATP produced. The leaf was running photosynthesis, etc., etc. So we got a lot of variations, but again, we're looking at just kind of the overview of how cells convert energy into ATP through cellular respiration. So we've already covered aerobic, where oxygen is present. Now we want to take a look at anaerobic respiration. And with anaerobic respiration, what we're going to see is that the cells don't have oxygen available. It's not part of this process. It's still going to occur in the cell, but it doesn't have oxygen, so it is not allowed to go to the mitochondria and go through all the different stages of aerobic respiration. Okay, so what we want to look at here, glycolysis happens. It's going to always happen, whether you're aerobic or anaerobic. Glycolysis will occur. So then we're sitting there with the two pyruvates. If oxygen is present, the cell goes through the pyruvate conversion into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA goes through the Krebs cycle. Those products eventually make it over to the electron transport chain within the mitochondria and pump out massive amounts of ATP. But that's not the case here. We're now moving into the anaerobic stage. So without oxygen, we will go down this pathway here. And in human muscle cells, so this is our body during exercise, if we push too hard, we go too much, and we just can't get enough oxygen in, our muscle cells will shift into an anaerobic environment or anaerobic condition because there's not enough oxygen. The pyruvates will be converted into a product called lactate. Now lactate is what causes that fatigue and cramping and that soreness you feel in your muscles. And the problem here is instead of producing NADHs and creating these wheelbarrows full of electrons and hydrogens, to turn the pyruvates into lactate, it uses those NADHs that were produced back during glycolysis. So the net yield of ATP in anaerobic respiration is incredibly poor. I'll show you some numbers in just a minute here, but it's just terrible, which is why we cannot sustain life in anaerobic environments for more than a few minutes. Cells, and I'm going to put this, let me insert a little note here. I want you guys to make sure you get this down. Cells, human cells, can typically only last a few minutes. So that cells can only sustain anaerobic conditions for about 2 to 3 minutes before they start to die. Not a good thing. Okay, so 2 to 3 minutes. This is why during exercise your body shuts down and it switches you back to aerobic, but you're not running as fast as you were before, you're not lifting as much of a weight, etc. Muscle fatigue is the body's way of saying you're now anaerobic. Consider the same thing will happen if somebody has a stroke or a heart attack. Blood flow does not get to a part of the body, the brain, the heart, wherever. Oxygen doesn't get there. Those cells then switch to anaerobic, and if oxygen is not restored quickly, they will die within a couple minutes. So it's not a good thing. So multicellular organisms, humans, other animals, in general, the muscle tissue goes through this pathway if it goes down the anaerobic process. Now, there are single-celled organisms out there, bacteria and yeast, all sorts of different things that can do anaerobic, but they go down this pathway here. And what we'll see in something like a yeast cell, if you force a yeast into an anaerobic condition, it will take the pyruvates, convert it into acetaldehyde, the NADHs drop off the hydrogens here, causing the acetaldehyde to be converted into ethanol. The byproduct of carbon dioxide is also produced. Ethanol is alcohol. This is how we make beer, this is how we make wine, this is how we produce fermented products. The carbon dioxide is the gas released during the process of fermentation. So, and I'll show you an example of that in a few minutes here. Okay, so some organisms out there can sustain life in anaerobic conditions. Instead of using oxygen to catch those electrons at the end of the electron transport system, they use carbon dioxide. So there's a group out there called the methanogens. These are different sulfur type of bacteria. They live in just some horrible, horrible environments. These are classified in domain Archaea. They will be within the Archaea grouping, and they can run this anaerobic respiration process without a problem. They're single-celled. They're okay with a limited amount of energy here. So certain life has adapted and evolved to this process, and it's thought some of the earliest life on Earth was using this before aerobic respiration became available, because oxygen has not always been available in the Earth's atmosphere. So we'll talk more about that later on when we get into evolution and look at history of life and the origin of life and those different topics. But you think about photosynthesis is what makes oxygen. Until something started photosynthesizing, there most likely would not have been oxygen on this planet. So, okay, so back to our making beer, wine. If you guys make pizza dough and the bread rises, that's a fermentation process. You're using yeast. Yeast is a fungi, single-celled fungi that you are forcing into an anaerobic environment. You want it to go anaerobic, so it takes the glucose, breaks it in half through glycolysis to create the pyruvates. NADHs are formed, ATP is formed, carbon dioxide can be formed, those pyruvates get converted into acetaldehyde. That converts into ethanol because of the NADHs, and you have your desired end product of that glass of wine, that bottle of beer, the bread dough that rose from the little ball, expanded out and became the big loaf of bread before you baked it. But keep in mind, there's not much ATP here. This is why fermentation is only going to work in single-celled organisms for any type of extended period of time. So the bottom one, the bottom example or diagram here shows lactic acid fermentation in muscle cells. Anybody who's ever exercised, you've felt that fatigue, that cramping. This athlete laying on the ground has a cramp. That's what's happening. Most of the time people associate cramps with, oh, I'm low on potassium or this or that. That can happen. But generally muscle fatigue is lack of oxygen. You are going anaerobic. So it's the body's way of saying, hey, you know what? You're not ready to sustain this output, this level of exertion. You need to back down a little bit. Okay, so things I want you to think about. Here's a big group of cross-country runners. So you have a couple hundred people here. Looks like males, the male cross-country team at an invite from a bunch of different schools. So all these guys are going out running as hard as they can. And everybody has a different threshold, what we call the anaerobic threshold. This is the point where you go from being aerobic and making lots and lots of ATP, usually about 36 ATP, and you shift over into anaerobic. and you go all the way down to about 2 ATP. So 36 down to 2. Huge difference. So the key for these runners is knowing where their threshold is at and trying to improve their threshold, trying to change their threshold. This is possible. But things that influence your threshold, there's a bunch of different factors here that we want to consider. The first one, your age. Generally, when you're younger, and I don't mean when you're 5, 6 years old, but when you're in your teens and 20s and even into your early 30s, your threshold typically is higher than when you're older, later in life, when you get into your 50s, 60s, etc. Your body is in its prime at that point, and that's generally when you have the highest threshold if you're actually trying to achieve a certain threshold. So we got age. Gender is another variable. Generally, and these are all generalizations, there's always exceptions to these rules, but generally men have a higher threshold. The reason for that? Simply, men have more muscle mass, generally, and that enables them to have more mitochondria, larger lung capacity. It's just basic physiology. Now, there are some phenomenal women runners who will outdo every male in the area, but overall, men tend to have a higher threshold than women. Your training. How much training are you doing? That's how you improve your threshold. You push yourself during practice, during training, to increase your threshold. So the more you train, the higher your threshold goes. Your genetics. Bottom line, some of us are never ever going to be good runners because we don't have the genetics for it. We don't have the body. We don't have the build. We don't have the physiology. There are other people who are just genetically gifted. But without training, without these other variables, your genetics can't do it all. And if you don't have the genetics, no matter how much you do everything else, you're probably not going to be an Olympic athlete. And then the last one is the environment. What's the environment like? Now, if you want to increase your threshold, train at high elevations. If you go up a mountain and train at a higher elevation, what you're actually going to do is force your body to increase your threshold. It's going to produce more red blood cells. Red blood cells carry oxygen. It's going to force it to actually work harder because there's less environmental oxygen available. People who can't go to a higher elevation are wearing oxygen masks to improve their anaerobic threshold and try to train their body to work harder so that way it forces it to build more red blood cells and raise that threshold up. Okay, so all these factors combine to give us an individual anaerobic threshold, that point when we switch from aerobic respiration over to anaerobic. Okay, so the primary ingredient for all of this respiration is always going to be glucose. That is your best ingredient. That's the one that our body wants to use because it's ready to go and can get turned into a lot of ATP. But we do have other options. We have what we call alternative pathways. We can take nucleic acids, break them down. We can take proteins, break them down. We can take complex polysaccharides, break those down, and we can do the same thing with lipids and fats and break them down. The key here is any of these other groups that you're trying to use for energy, where does it enter the pathway of cellular respiration, and what is the yield of ATP that you're going to get? That's an important factor. The other very, very important factor to consider is not just the yield of ATP, but the byproducts that are produced during that conversion of whatever macromolecule you're working with. Does it produce harmful byproducts that are stressful on the body? So things to think about. We'll talk a little bit more about that with enzymes and pathways. But if you're using proteins as your main energy source, is that really a good source? Is that going to create problems and stress on the body? Versus if you're using lipids or polysaccharides or the nucleic acids. So ultimately, We always want to keep making ATP.